Tonight we're going to primarily focus on three chapters of the book of 1 Kings, chapters 20, 21, and the biggest part of chapter 22. And those three chapters, in large measure, show really the last days of the king Ahab, of the northern nation, or the northern 10 tribes. And his last days really can be summarized in some ways in three different military events that really focus on three different cities. The first is the capital city of Samaria. The second is Aphek, which is to the northeast. And then the third, involving Ramoth Gilead, the battle that ensues that ends up where his life is taken by the Lord in my judgment. Really, all three of those military battles involve one foe, and that is the nation of Syria or Aram, at least under the guidance of Ben-Hadad, their king. Now, there's some argument among commentators if this is Ben-Hadad the first or the second, because there's some issues regarding chronology, when these actually happened. I don't know if it's particularly meaningful if we can decide one way or the other, because Ben-Hadad is really just a dynastic throne name. It's like Pharaoh or Caesar. He says, I am the son of the god Hadad. That's what the name means. And so as we distinguish between the kings, it may not be that crucial for our realization. But that's kind of the three cities that we're going to be focusing on. You can see those here on the map. I mean, Aphek really to the northeast of the Sea of Chinnereth. We have Ramoth Gilead in the territory of Gilead, and then Samaria down to the south there, designated by a star. Those are the three locations that we're focusing on in those three chapters here tonight. So with that being said, let's just jump into the text, because that's really how the text takes place. In chapter 20, the scene just opens, and the next thing we know that Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, along with 32 other kings, are besieging Samaria. Now, those 32 kings are probably family kings. They're heads of families, patriarchs. They're probably water chiefs that are heads of large groups of families that run around the oasis there in Damascus. But those 32 kings, along with Ben-Hadad, are besieging Samaria. And the question is really in the biblical text, the narrative, we don't have any real lead up to that. We don't see a lot of exchange. I mean, they've had some conflicts in the past. But really in chapter 20, it just kind of burst on the scene. The next thing you know, he's besieging this city. And the fact is not only is he besieging this city, it seems as if that Ahab has already pledged some fealty, or he is a vassal to Ben-Hadad in this text. Because Ben-Hadad, he comes up and sends messengers and he makes demands upon Ahab. And look at how Ahab addresses him in chapter 20 in verse 4. The king of Israel replied, "It is according to your word, my lord. O king, I am yours and all that I have." And what he's referring to when he says all that I have, he's talking about his gold, his silver, his most beautiful wives, and his children. He is pledging that to Ben-Hadad. But these negotiations or these communication reach a breaking point, and what seems to be the line that the people cannot cross? What is the thing that stalls these negotiations in this text? What stands out here in this text? Why didn't they continue in this and everything go away? Well, it seems like it's the demand by Ben-Hadad's messenger that we get to come in to your city and pick out the things that are most precious to you. It's not like you can offer tribute to us. We're going to come into your house and decide the thing that is most precious in your eyes, and we're going to take it. And Ahab, he goes to the elders of Israel and he lays this out and says, "You shall not consent, O king." Now, I want you to understand here, I think this tells us something about Ahab. Ahab was willing to give his gold, his silver, and his wives and his children. But the line he wouldn't cross seems to be allowing someone else to come in to his household or the elder's household and choose things for themselves. He was willing to give up his own family members rather than some of the things that he counted as more precious to him. And then what really transpires in this text is this. They begin to posture. They begin to kind of taunt one another. This is ancient Near East smack talk. And it begins with really the king of Samaria making a solemn vow to his God and said, there is not enough dust in Samaria to fill the hands of my soldiers. And then Ahab follows with this. He says, the king of Israel replied, tell him, he who straps on his weapons had better not boast like the one who takes them off. You know what he's saying? He said, you shouldn't boast as if you are already victorious before you go out to fight the battle. I mean, ours doesn't sound as cool, but don't count your eggs before they hatch. I mean, that's kind of the same kind of thing. I mean, that doesn't sound near as threatening or as cool, but that's really what these two kings are engaged in, is this posturing with one another here before the battle. And then Ben-Hadad besieges or stands against the city. Now, the rest of the text, it kind of gets more interesting from that point on. In chapter 20, beginning in verse 13, we have an unnamed prophet who approaches Ahab. And when he approaches Ahab, he basically uses a rhetorical question and makes a promise from the Lord in verse 13. He says, have you seen all this great multitude? I mean, it's kind of a rhetorical question. Yes, I've seen the army encamped against Samaria. But notice what he says, I will deliver them into your hand today. Now, knowing what we know about King Ahab, what would we think his response would be? I mean, how has he reacted to the Lord? What is his disposition toward God? What is his disposition toward the prophets been so far in his reign? But running contrary to his stated nature, what we see him do is obey. He asks questions of the prophet. In verse 14, he says, by whom? And the prophet says, thus says the Lord, by the young men of the rulers of the provinces. Then he said, who shall begin the battle? And he answered, you. And then what does Ahab do? He musters his army. That's totally out of character almost from what we would expect of Ahab, but yet that's what we see him do. And what he does is he goes amongst the rulers of the people and he is able to gather 232 different young men. And then it says 7,000 of the regular army who would go out and fight this battle. And the Lord says he would defeat Ben-Hadad and his army. I mean, 7,232, chapter 20, verse 1 says, Ben-Hadad says, all my army. Doesn't sound like good odds. But yet, that's what the Lord has promised, that he would deliver them into his hands. So the next day, noon occurs, and apparently noon is kind of like in many desert countries, that's a time that people recline from work, they rest, and we see Ben-Hadad doing what? Drinking as to get drunk. Just like former kings that we've looked at. And the men come out, and they each kill their man, and they rout the armies of Aram. They lead them away. But the question is, why was God being so gracious? So what do you see in this text? Why did God do what he did? I mean, Ahab's wicked. Ahab has shown his wickedness. He's more wicked than any king before him. You see the idol worship that he allowed his wife Jezebel to run rapid. Why was God so gracious? What does the text tell us? Barb? Yeah. To show that I'm Lord. And in that one statement, there is so much packed into that one phrase. First of all, you see the wonderful grace and mercy of the Lord that was even being extended to such a one as wicked Ahab. I think that's tied up into that text. But the second thing is to realize that who reigns, and that is God. Even in this despotic, tyrannical king who's full of wickedness, never forgets who actually reigns over Israel, and that is God Almighty. So the people will know that he is the Lord. Now, so that's the story of really the first kind of battle here around Samaria. And I think it's an interesting contrast that we see between the two kings, right? So we see King Ahab unusual as it is, being driven by the word of the Lord and given strength by the word of the Lord, but yet Ben-Hadad, who is secure in his own strength, is beguiled by drink and ends up losing his war. I mean, I'm going to tell you, in some ways, this is an illustration exactly of Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 18. You know, where we're told not to be drunk, but be filled with the Spirit, being directed by God's word. That is exactly, almost to a T, what this illustrates for us. And we see the kind of two different disastrous results here in these kings. So, that's the first battle. So we moved, but he warns the prophet, the unnamed prophet, at the end of this. He says, don't grow lax. Don't grow complacent. Because you know what? Ben-Hadad's not done. Notice what he says in verse 22 of the text. He says, then the prophet approached the king of Israel and said to him, go show yourself courageous and be aware and see what you have to do. For at the turn of the year, the king of Aram will march against you. Do you see? He instructs Ahab further to be diligent, to be aware, to be on his guard, to act as a true leader and shepherd of his people. And you know what? It seems like Ahab does it. He warns them of the things that are ahead. So that's the first military event there around Samaria. Next, really beginning in verse 23, we go through the nation of Aphek, or the city of Aphek. That's going to come into play. And it seems like it's the turn of the year, maybe the time the kings go out to war in the springtime. And Ben-Hadad is going to turn his attention again to King Ahab and the people of Israel. Because I want you to understand that Ben-Hadad, I'll get it straightened out here in a minute, seemed to misinterpret the data. I mean, he analyzed his defeat. And he says, you know what? You know why we lost? Because their God's a God of the mountains, and that's where we fought them. You know, if we had a different location, you know, the outcome would be totally different. So he analyzed his defeat at the hand of the Israelites, and his conclusion was this: we fought in the wrong place because their God was too strong there. But if we go somewhere else, all too different story. Now, I want you to see that statement because I think there's a subtle shift in the story here. And what I mean by that is, up until this point, it's been Ben-Hadad against Ahab. Leader against leader, nation against nation. But now, Ben-Hadad sees himself in contest with the Lord. And so he can manipulate events, and I'm going to fight against this Lord of Israel who's the God of the mountains. I'm going to take him down in the plain. And we see that Ben-Hadad is very serious, more serious, about his preparation for war this time. I mean, look what he sets out to do. He, first of all, replaces those kings with captains in verse 23. Again, kind of seeming like an insignificant detail, but most likely those kings were just figureheads. They gained it by lineage or something along those lines, but they probably didn't know how to fight a war real well. So they took some of the regular army, the captains, and put them in charge of the different companies. I'm much more serious this time. Ben-Hadad says, I want you to duplicate my army down to the last horse and soldier. I want the exact same force. And then third, he chooses his place to engage in battle. And that is the city of Aphek, if that's up near the Sea of Chinnereth. And so he sets out to engage in war. Now, the contest is not going to be much different than what it has been before in some regards. So, what happens? So, the Lord there, as we begin, it says, as we begin to look at this text, he sets out to defeat them. They set up for 7 days and wait to attack. And in one day, Ahab and his forces killed 100,000 of Ben-Hadad's army. 100,000. The remaining portion of his army flees to the city of Aphek, and the walls fall down and kill an additional 27,000. So Ahab and his forces kill a force of 127,000 people, at least the way the text lays it out here. Now, let me ask you a question. In Israel's history, can you think of another battle where the walls fell down? Joshua 6, what's happened in Joshua 6? The Jericho incident. So let me ask you a question. At Jericho, because the Lord gave them the victory, what was all the possessions of Jericho? Who were they dedicated to? Right. Because the Lord won the victory, everything that came from the victory belonged to the Lord. They were under the ban, okay? Now, I believe that there's some correlation here. They would think about this with the city of Jericho. One writer said it this way. He said, the striking parallels to the conquest of Jericho as the interval of 7 days before the battle, the falling of the city walls, clearly identified the battles at Samaria and Aphek as holy war. And I want to focus on that last phrase, holy war, because what we're going to find here is that King Ahab didn't dedicate everything to the ban. The fact is, he didn't destroy everything, does he? And that's what we're going to see played out, and there's going to be some consequences related to that. So that was really the Battle of Aphek to some degree, but the question is, why did the Lord, again, what reasons does the text tell us? Why did the Lord there do what he did? When he came in verse 28, the man of God came near and spoke to Israel. Why did he choose to intervene and fight for Ahab and the nation of Israel? What's the choices given there in the text? Okay. So Gary points out it's because there's two becauses really there, or two causes or reasons the Lord states. The first of what is what Ben-Hadad had concluded, that somehow God was limited to the mountains instead of being sovereign God over all the nation. And the second one is a repetition of the first one, so that they will know that I am the Lord. Those are the reasons that the man of God gives for this victory. Now, so let's move on, because what happens there after the defeat of Ben-Hadad? Ben-Hadad, who had been hiding in the city, goes into an inner room, and after the defeat, he begins to fear for his life. His servants make this comment about the kings of Israel. They're more compassionate or more full of loving kindness than all the other kings. So they say, let's prostrate ourselves before them. Let's put a rope around our necks and approach them as servants. And they do so on behalf of Ben-Hadad. And Ahab says, oh, you mean Ben-Hadad's still alive? He's my brother. And they enter into a covenant with one another. And here's the terms of the covenant. Ben-Hadad, I'm going to give you back all the cities that my ancestors took from you. And those may be the cities that we read of back in 1 Kings chapter 15 under the reign of Baasha in the north and Asa in the south. But he said, I'm going to give you those back. And then I'm going to give you some streets into Damascus. That's kind of a weird thing. It's probably just saying, you know what? I'm going to let you have some exclusive trade rights within my capital city. There's going to be some areas that set aside that you can maybe not have any tariffs on it or any exports, but right in the city of Damascus, there's going to be some streets dedicated to you. And so he establishes this covenant. Now remember, should he have made this covenant? Should he have allowed Ben-Hadad, this enemy of the Lord, to go free? And we're going to find out the conclusion in what some have called kind of an enacted parable. There was one of the sons of the prophets in verse 35. Now, the sons of the prophets are normally connected with Elisha, but somehow it makes it into this first part of the story in Elijah. This group of prophets, these spokesmen of the Lord, he comes up and he calls on, it says in the text, another to strike him. Now, it could be his neighbor, that's one thing, or it could be another prophet. The text would allow for either one. He says, I want you to strike me. And that person refuses. You know what happens to him? A lion comes and devours him. Just like back in 1 Kings chapter 13, when the young prophet turned away from the way of the Lord and chose to disobey, the lion consumed him. He turned to another and said, strike me. And then the prophet really disguised himself. He had blood on his features, looked like he had been wounded in battle. King Ahab comes by and he tells him this story. And here's the story. He says, you know, I was in battle and I was entrusted to basically guard this prisoner. But you know what? I got busy going here and there. And I turned my back and he was gone. That's basically the story. And you know what King Ahab's response is to him in verse 40? He says, so shall your judgment be, you have decided it. He says, because you've admitted this thing, basically your life is forfeited, you pay a fine. Basically, this parable acts just like Nathan did when he confronted David. Ahab pronounces his own judgment because he did the exact same thing with Ben-Hadad. He let him go. And it's opposed to the Lord's will. That's what it says in verse 42 of the text. He said to him, thus says the Lord, because you have let go out of your hand the man whom I devoted to destruction, therefore your life shall go for his life, and your people for his people. You go out of your hand the man whom I have devoted to destruction. The Hebrew word there is to the ban. That's the same word we read over in Joshua chapter 6. He was held accountable because the Lord won this victory, and all the fruits of the victory belong to the Lord. So the question then is, how did Ahab react? So the prophet confronts him. He rebukes him. How does Ahab react? Well, poorly. How does he react to this instruction from the Lord? Well, he's sullen and he's vexed. He acts like a fool. He doesn't receive the wise instruction of the Lord. And I want you to pay particular attention to this because this phrase is going to come up another couple of times in the text until it doesn't, which is kind of weird how the story goes and maybe a little encouraging at the same time. So he's sullen and vexed when the Lord rebukes him. Instead of humbling himself or throwing himself prostrate and begging the Lord's forgiveness, it just says that he's sullen and vexed. And thus really ends these first two of these military campaigns against his life. Now, these two battles or events kind of follow a similar formula, right, in the way the literature is laid out. You have this consultation and a mustering of forces, you have a confrontation in the battle, and then you have a result. And to some degree, the results are the same. They're both victorious. But the aftermath of the victory is dramatically different. And let me suggest one reason why. So you remember at the end of the Battle of Samaria, the prophet came and warned of the fact that Ben-Hadad was going to come again. And he called Ahab to be aware, to prepare, to be vigilant. But when he defeats him the second time and he enforces a covenant, King Ahab stops looking to the future. Good times are here. My enemies are conquered. And what we see, it's always a danger for the people of God when they grow complacent. That's always been the pattern throughout the Bible. When they stop taking their eyes off the potential enemies on the horizon and grow complacent in their own strength and think the covenants that they've made with those people around them, it always leads to disaster. And despite how much these stories parallel with one another, they dramatically diverge from one another based upon the direction that Ahab is going to go. So, that's chapter 20, at least in a flyby. Chapter 21, the story we all know about King Ahab. We know two stories primarily about King Ahab. We know about Elijah's confrontation with the prophets of Baal, and we know 1 Kings chapter 21. That is Naboth's vineyard. So King Ahab, who is in his palace in Jezreel, sees this vineyard and desires it. Now, right away, we are kind of given a piece of information that seems contradictory to what we've already noticed. Remember, Omri established the capital in Samaria, right? That is the capital city of the northern 10 tribes. But the fact is the family home of what they call the Omri dynasty is in Jezreel. And we would call this maybe a summer palace or a winter palace, something along those lines. He's not necessarily moved the capital, but that is a place that he primarily resides. And he's there in the capital of Jezreel. He sees this vineyard and desires it for himself as a vegetable garden. Now, I want you to first of all stop right there and just notice this about King Ahab. He first approaches Naboth and he offers him a fair price, right? I mean, he is not initially trying to take advantage of Naboth. He says, I'll give you a vineyard better than this one, or I'll give you monetary value. He is not taking it by force, but it quickly escalates to that with his wife Jezebel. And I'm just going to tell you, again, we've kind of done this throughout this text. This is exactly what God said would happen. You remember when Samuel talked about the kings? What did he say in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 14? The time will come, they will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive groves, and give them to his servants. That is the nature of a king who is like those around him rather than after God's own heart. So that's what we begin to see Ahab doing. I'm just going to tell you, Naboth refuses. And in the text, it specifically says, because the Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers. Property rights and the transfer of property in Israel or God's people is kind of a difficult subject. From what I can understand, they were not prohibited from making a sale, but they couldn't be forced to do so, okay? And the reason he says I couldn't be forced to do so is because this belongs to my father. I mean, I've invested all of my life into this. This is what God has given me. And he seems to make an appeal to the law. And back in Numbers chapter 36, in verse 7, I mean, we see this as what Naboth is appealing to, this idea that God has given him this inheritance and they ought to be satisfied with it. In verse 7, thus no inheritance of the sons of Israel shall be transferred from tribe to tribe, for the sons of Israel shall each hold to the inheritance of the tribe of his father. And the reason I said what I said before, because sometimes you get a little conflicting information. They might have been able to for periods of time, but they couldn't ever transfer permanent ownership. I could lease it to you, basically, for a period of time. We might use that terminology, and we see that taking place occasionally throughout the Old Testament. But Naboth responds and refuses Ahab's. And what's Ahab do? What's he do? Yeah. Exactly. Those two words again, sullen and vexed, and then he goes and lays his head against the wall. Sherry, does Matt do that? No. Okay. So he turns his face to the wall, and then Jezebel approaches him, and she asks him this probing question in verse 7. Do you now reign over Israel? You can almost feel the scorn in Jezebel's voice. Jezebel comes from the line of the Phoenician kings who they had the absolute right of kings. And she is asking him a question, who's really in charge around here? You're going to let this person, Naboth, stand in your way of the royal right of kings? Are you going to let him stand and thwart what your desires are? And Jezebel says, don't worry, I'll take care of it. And really, in this point in the story in chapter 21, she begins to reign in earnest. If you want to know who reigns in Israel in chapter 21 on, at least in this story, it's Jezebel. I mean, just look in the story. Look down in verse 8. She wrote letters in Ahab's name. She sealed them with his seal. And she sent letters to the elders and to the nobles who were living with Naboth in this city. She was the one ruling for all practical purposes. And you can see how vindictive and you can see how ruthless she is. She concocts this plan. She said, we're going to throw a feast, and we're going to bring Naboth and set him at the head. And we're going to bring two worthless men, and they're going to bring false charges against Naboth. And you're going to get the vineyard that you always desired. And so they bring charges against Naboth and said he cursed God and the king. I want you to notice that. Which of those in the law of Moses was actually a capital crime? Which one of those? Cursing the king or cursing the Lord? Only one of those. And that is cursing the Lord according to Leviticus chapter 24, verse 16. But she equated cursing the king just as bad as cursing the Lord. She puts them both together in this text because she sees the divine right of kings. That's how the Phoenicians ruled, and that's how Ahab should have acted. So Naboth is taken out, he's stoned and killed, and he is given the vineyard. Now, a familiar character comes back into the story again. We've had a few nameless prophets, some sons of the prophets, but now Elijah the Tishbite comes back onto the scene, and God has given him insight in what has transpired. And he confronts Ahab. And I want us to just look at this, at what he describes Ahab as doing. Look down in verse 20 of 1 Kings chapter 21. He said, Ahab said to Elijah, "Have you found me, O my enemy?" And he answered, "I have found you because you have sold yourself to do evil in the sight of the Lord." Do you realize that, first of all, how he describes Elijah has escalated, right? Remember what he used to call Elijah? The troubler of Israel, or the bringer of destruction. Here he is actually his enemy. And again, I can't help but draw a parallel to Galatians. Am I your enemy because I tell you the truth? I mean, that's kind of almost this type of language replicated in the New Testament. But notice what Elijah says about him. You have sold yourself to do evil. Your greed, unchecked, has caused you to sell your very life, your integrity, your royal justice. It's caused you to sell yourself. I mean, that is such a picturesque way of describing what Ahab did. He sold himself to his desires. He sold himself for his lack of self-discipline. He sold himself over a vineyard. And notice how he goes on just to describe his reign in 25 and 26. He says, "Surely there was no one like Ahab, who sold himself to do evil in the sight of the Lord, because Jezebel his wife incited him. He acted very abominably in following idols, according to all that the Amorites had done, whom the Lord had cast out before the sons of Israel." And through Elijah, the Lord pronounced judgment. He first of all says that here in this vineyard, your blood will be licked up by the dogs. Furthermore, he says your line would be like the line of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. It will be wiped out. And he even speaks of Jezebel, that the dogs would eat of her body. And we see that take place, don't we? Here in this very story, we read of Ahab. And then in 2 Kings chapter 9, we read of his son Joram, who is wiped out to kind of end that line. And then in Jezebel as well, with the wiping out of the dynasty. So God passes judgment through Elijah. So, how's Ahab reacted so far in our story when he's been rebuked? Twice. He grew sullen and vexed, right? So the first time he's grown sullen and vexed, and then he pouted. What do we expect him to do here? I mean, Elijah comes and pretty much lays it on him. To keep in character, we would expect him to be sullen and vexed, right? I mean, that would be in keeping with his character. That's how he's reacted each time that the Lord has rebuked him through a prophet. But that's not what we see happen here. The fact of the matter is, Ahab repents. And it's just so amazing. Listen to this. Now, do you see, look if you will, in verse 27. It came about when Ahab heard these words that he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and fasted. And he lay in sackcloth and went about despondently. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, do you see how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because he has humbled himself before me, I will not bring about the evil in his days, but I will bring the evil upon his house in his son's days. Did you see that coming? I didn't. I would expect Ahab to be sullen and vexed. I would expect Ahab to bow up. I would expect Ahab to spit in the eye of God's prophet. But he humbles himself, so much so that the Lord remarks on it. The Lord remarks, do you see it? And he relents. And the reason I say it's in a surprising term, but it's also an encouraging thing, it's not too late. Now, he doesn't seem to carry this out through his life. But here, even in spite of all the evil he did, he humbled himself and he repented, and the Lord recognized it. Now, as we think about chapter 21 as a whole, I just got one little quote I'd like to share with you. I think is kind of an application from this text. In chapter 21, the story of Naboth warns against the use of piety and legality to cloak injustice. It teaches that those who support the plots of a Jezebel, whether by silent acquiescence or overt complicity, share her crime. It is a resounding affirmation that injustices touch God, that as you did it to one of the least of these brethren, you did it to me. Jezebel has her own judgment, but most of this chapter is directed toward Ahab and his failure, even though Jezebel was acting in his name. And we need to acknowledge that as well. The last chapter, chapter 22. So in chapter 22, 3 years have passed. And really the question comes, and it seems like maybe Ramoth Gilead was one of those cities that Ben-Hadad promised to return, but it hasn't returned to their hands. So Ahab aligns himself with King Jehoshaphat of Judah to go out and to wage war against Ramoth Gilead and take it back. Now the question is why is King Jehoshaphat up here anyway? The only thing I can say from the text is back in 2 Chronicles chapter 18, verse 1, he allied himself to Ahab by marriage. So maybe that marriage alliance was part of the reason that he was there and being willing to fight this battle with King Ahab. But Jehoshaphat then makes the famous statement, he would like to hear the word from the Lord. And Ahab, as he is wont to do, reaches in his pocket and pulls out 400 prophets. I mean, he had 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah walking around the palace previous. Now he's got 400 prophets of Baal. And you know what they tell him? He asked the question, should we go up and take it? And he said, yes, you should go up. To the man. And the story kind of goes, Jehoshaphat seems to didn't take that at face value. Is there anyone else? And he says, there's one guy, but I hate him. He always speaks against me. But eventually that prophet Micaiah is brought and encouraged to come. The funny thing is when he is brought, as he is being brought, Zedekiah makes these iron horns and runs around like Ahab and his forces are going to gore the people, right? Could you kind of imagine that scene? King Jehoshaphat and King Ahab sitting there with all their finery, and Zedekiah and the prophets running around with these iron horns on their heads. But Micaiah is brought, and the messenger brings them. He says, listen, agree with the king. That's what he tells him. He says, for everybody's sake, just agree and go along with everything. That's what he tells him. But Micaiah says in verse 14, as the Lord lives, what the Lord says to me, that I shall speak. whether it goes against the grain, whether it's what you want to hear or not, that's what I'm going to speak. And then he begins to speak, and I'm going to tell you everything that Micaiah says troubles someone. It troubles the king, it troubles the prophets, and to some degree it even troubles us because we don't quite always feel comfortable what he ends up saying. So first of all, he says the same thing that the other prophets were saying. Yes, you should go up to Ramoth Gilead, but he must have said it in such a way or with his facial expressions that Ahab just didn't believe his words. And he says in verse 16, how many times must I adjure you to speak to me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord? That's rich coming from Ahab. But I mean, that's what he says to Micaiah. I mean, how many times have I told you I only want to hear the truth when that's just the opposite? So Micaiah does, and he tells them about how the hills are barren, scattered over the mountain. The sheep have no shepherd, verse 17. They have no master, and each of them returns to their house in peace. And Ahab says these fatal words. He said, speaking to King Jehoshaphat, did I not tell you that he would not prophesy good concerning me, but... And then Jehoshaphat tells this story about a scene in heaven and the prophets being sent a lying spirit. Now, I want to talk about that just quickly because there's lots that we can say about this. First of all, there's a question of whether these were actual events that unfolded or just kind of as a parable or a vision, an illustration, if you will, of what really took place. That, first of all, know that. But secondly, the things I want you to see about that, instead of getting caught up in all the weeds and trying to discern, answer questions that we can't, I'm going to give you three things about what Micaiah says here. First of all, this is clearly to be seen as a denunciation of the 400 prophets. What he says, the words that they speak are lies. What the advice they give King Ahab is not the truth. Secondly, a lot of people ask the question, well, how can the Lord send a lying spirit? Can some charge be brought against the Lord? And the point is no. I mean, he's telling him what he done. He's given Ahab opportunity to repent of this. He doesn't have to go up to Ramoth Gilead. So whatever we understand here, there's really no charge that we can lay against the Lord. But I think the point of this story is simply this. It's focusing on, even in these details, God's sovereignty in bringing about the destruction of Ahab like spoken by Elijah. Because Ahab's going to do what he wants to do. And he's going to find the voice that reinforces what he wants to do. And the Lord realizes that and uses that even to his own destruction. So quickly, we're running out of time, just quickly run through this. So they go up to fight the battle. Ahab disguises himself, sends Jehoshaphat out in his royal robes, knowing that Ben-Hadad would focus his attention on the king. One of the texts, the men begin to pursue Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat cries out. And I love what it says. When he cries out, the Lord delivers him. That's what the text says in 2 Chronicles 18. But Ahab is then, by happenstance, if you want to use that word, talks about his death. Said, now one man drew his bow at random. And the question is, there's no random act here. Because this is fulfilling exactly what God had to fulfill. Go on, I'm out of time. Let's read this one text. So the Lord died and was brought to, the king died and was brought to Samaria, and they buried the king in Samaria. They washed out the chariot by the pool of Samaria, and the dogs licked up his blood. It was there that the prostitutes bathed themselves in accordance with the word of the Lord, which he had spoken. Elijah and the Lord's judgment was brought to pass in the life of King Ahab. And this kind of ends this complex character in this series of his life. Thanks, everyone, for your attention. We tried to cover a lot. We'll send out questions and continue on our study next week. Thanks.